I'd like to just extend my thanks. I'm honored to be here. I'd like to thank Masako Yonekawa and Ricoh University for inviting me. Masako's research and mine are complementary in many ways. We're both conducting interviews in a spirit of inquiry. We're trying to interview as many Rwandan refugees as possible. We're trying to go beyond conventional assumptions and unearth stories that have remained buried, and we're questioning claims that are often repeated but not verified and lack a strong factual foundation. Many of these claims have been absorbed and regurgitated to the detriment of safety and dignity of Rwandan refugees over the last 3 decades. Our research seeks to better understand the painful history of Central Africa, how it happened and why. So most importantly, we both seek to identify and understand the mistakes the West has made in policy. The official narrative of the genocide was created by the Rwandan Patriotic Front and cast in stark ethnic terms. The one category of victim, one category of perpetrator model has been used to defend and justify the indefensible. This narrative has changed the lives of millions of people in Rwanda and Congo. My work seeks specifically to re-examine the genocide. We know there was a genocide against the Tutsis, but how it occurred and what happened to Hutus has been less clear historically speaking. The re-examine of the violence in 1994 leads us to invariably to the central question of why Rwandans who fled in 1994 and after are unwilling to go home. By critically examining the RPF's record on an evidence basis, by looking at what they did before, during, and after the genocide, we become able to see their capacity for deception. I believe that in piercing the RPF's capacity to deceive, in seeing it and exposing it, we then need to accept a paradigm shift in how we view repatriation and UN policy regarding Rwandan refugees. I was compelled to re-examine the genocide after a life-changing trip to Congo as a young journalist covering the humanitarian crisis, just days after Mobutu Sese Seko had been toppled by Paul Kagame's troops and their rebel allies in May 1997. So by the time I got there, Rwandan troops were in firm control of Congo's main cities, its villages, and even strategic areas of the forests. I went into the forests of Congo with local aid workers from the UNHCR, Doctors Without Borders, and the Red Cross, who were conducting search and rescue missions to find missing Rwandan Hutu refugees. We were looking for survivors of attacks by Kagame's Tutsi soldiers, and what I saw firsthand was the ugly face of the RPF. I met dozens of survivors who were battling disease, infection, and hunger. They were on death's door. The scenes of suffering and witness accounts of atrocities have never left me. The refugees south of Kisangani in northeastern Zaire told me that Rwandan troops speaking Kinyarwanda had opened fire on their camps and killed tens of thousands of their family members. So these survivors who were strong enough scattered after the attacks, and then they were chased some more by Kagame's troops. Some survivors were caught again and forced by Rwandan soldiers to bury their loved ones. We largely know this horrifying story, but it was in Congo that I got clues in those interviews to another disturbing story. I wanted to know why most of the Rwandan Hutu refugees who had fled Rwanda in the first place, why they fled and why they stayed in the camps in eastern Congo after the genocide and refused to go home. If Hutus had killed Tutsis and the RPF had stopped the genocide and the international community was insisting it was safe to go back to their homeland, why didn't they go home? They told me they fled Rwanda in 1994 in the first place because the RPF had killed their families. They were afraid of them. They said they stayed in the camps because they were afraid to go home. And when I first heard this, I was astonished and skeptical. But after hearing it anecdotally so many times, the story started to coalesce and settle in my brain. These refugees also told me that other refugees who had been pushed or encouraged to go home by the United Nations and the new Rwandan government were disappearing. One of the most striking and tragic inconsistencies was the repatriation against their will of many Rwandan refugees who were found in the forest, sick. Expatriate staff of the United Nations insisted these refugees, even Rwandan orphans who had been taken in by Congolese families, had to go back to Rwanda. This was UN policy. The UNHCR and aid agencies argued that returning home would be safer for the refugees, even though the refugees said that they would face even more danger going back to Rwanda. Somehow they knew what awaited them. In the end, refugees were given minimal food and sent to transit camps from the forest before being loaded onto planes and sent back to Rwanda. Yet the UN knew full well that it was the Rwandan forces who had chased and killed Rwandan refugees in Congo. So their insistence that refugees would be safer in Rwanda, a country that had ordered the massacres, made no sense whatsoever. So herein lay one of the first most flagrant ethical and moral contradictions on the part of the UNHCR that I came across. Sending refugees back to the people who killed their families was a serious breach of trust with regard to the UN's responsibility to protect Rwandan refugees. None of the UN expatriate staff would speak on the record about this reality. They often referred to the attacks in the jungle in passive, abstract terms as violence against refugees or the Troubles. And yet, Médecins Sans Frontières, the NGO Doctors Without Borders, had released an important report saying 200,000 Rwandan refugees were missing and had likely been killed, but no one would talk about this on the ground. I eventually went to Rwanda and I interviewed people in transit camps and villages. These were difficult interviews, but I managed to discover a few things. The Hutus in Rwanda now lived in fear, and like Tutsis, they were mourning the loss of their family members who had been killed in the genocide. I also realized that many refugees who were returning to Rwanda in 1997 did not have access to their homes because they were occupied by Tutsi families. The representative for the UNHCR in Rwanda, Roman Arasa, confirmed this in our interview in Kigali. It was a very unstable time in 1997. It was not clear who was behind a spate of attacks in the northwest of the country. As time went on, it became clearer that the RPF was conducting ethnic cleansing in the northwest region of Rwanda. It was after this trip to Congo that doubts turned to disbelief on my part over the claims that the RPF had stopped the violence in 1994 and was at the forefront of an African renaissance. There's something I want to make very clear. There's been, historically speaking, a lack of rigorous, independently conducted interviews with Rwandan Hutu refugees in Central Africa, why they fled in the first place, and there's been a lack of interviews with Tutsis who have broken with the regime in intervening years. This lack of empirical studies has been a colossal failure on the part of human rights activists, NGOs, the United Nations, academics, and journalists, and it has impeded our understanding of the dynamics of violence. Over the years, I've interviewed hundreds of victims and witnesses, direct and contextual, along with former members of Kagame's army intelligence who broke free and fled. I've also spoken with lawyers and investigators who worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. I wanted to understand the mechanics of Kagame's killing machine and what the violence looked like, how they got away with it. I also wanted to understand who let them get away with it and why. The core conclusions of my book, In Praise of Blood, are based on testimony from my interviews and from leaked UN documents. They are the following. Kagame and his RPF ignited the genocide by shooting down the plane that carried Rwanda's President Juvenal Habyarimana and his Burundian counterpart Cyprien Ntare Amira. So immediately after the plane attack, Kagame's soldiers and officers from various divisions of the army worked behind the battlefront. They operated in every area they seized from Hutu forces, and they did so with mobile forces, starting in the north. So they went from the north down the eastern flank of the country, and they targeted Hutu community leaders and then went after peasants. They invited Hutu peasants to meetings, then slaughtered them and buried them, sometimes with the Tutsis who had been killed by Hutu militia known as Interahamwe. So some of the Hutus the RPF killed were put in mass graves with those Tutsis who had been killed by the Hutu militia. And sometimes Hutus were loaded onto trucks and taken to the forest where they were burned. So we had two dynamics. We have Tutsis being systematically targeted and killed in Hutu-controlled zones, and Hutus being systematically targeted and killed by the RPF in RPF-controlled zones. And so there were no observers seeing what was going on, but the United Nations had a certain degree of knowledge of some of the killings. The RPF actually, the United Nations documented some of them. The RPF got away with these crimes because the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda allowed it to, and they did so at the request of the United States, Rwanda's major Western ally. So essentially, the RCTR refused to indict Kagame and his senior military commanders for these crimes. It buried the evidence and cemented Kagame's impunity. My book also reveals that RPF commandos from various divisions of the army participated directly in killing Tutsis, not only in the capital, but all over Rwanda. So these operations created more Tutsi victims, ignited more of a moral outcry, demonized the Hutu regime and civilians in general. The infiltration by the RPF throughout Rwanda was key to its success in seizing territories, and it gives us clues as to how the genocide unfolded. This was planned and in place before the plane was shot down. So the RPF not only infiltrated the Interahamwe, but they infiltrated other youth wings, other militias, and they killed two key Hutu politicians in February 1994. So the killings of these two individuals that the RPF was responsible for sparked violence in Butare and Kigali that left 37 people dead. And this was actually a prefecture, an area that had been heavily infiltrated by the RPF prior to the genocide. Tutsi civilians were also being used by the RPF. They were being brought into the capital and to the RPF's headquarters in a building known as the CND. So they became what we call in English a fifth column. So right before the genocide was unleashed, the RPF had 600 cells throughout the country, 147 of them in the capital. Very briefly, I'd like to paint a picture of what northern Rwanda looked like after the RPF invaded in December 1990, because there's very little documented about what Rwanda was like before the genocide. One of the founders of the RPF has described, along with Italian and Belgian Catholic priests, have described the horrors of the RPF invasion. Major Alphonse Faruma has talked to how the RPF committed massacres, looted properties, and destroyed crops to make the Hutu population move. As they displaced the Hutu population in the north, what they began to do was create a Tutsi land in those areas, and these were this was a place where Tutsi refugees who had been living in exile in Uganda since the early 1960s started to create their homes. The RPF also shelled refugee camps that kept moving with mortars and rocket launchers. An Italian priest I interviewed told me that the RPF used to lay landmines in areas where children used to play, and these exploded and mutilated children. By the end of 1993, up to 1 million Hutus were displaced and living in squalor in displacement camps. So in these camps, sanitation and malnutrition were pressing problems. The children contracted scabies, parasitic infections, diarrhea, tuberculosis, and all kinds of respiratory illnesses. So it was then in this desperate context that the seeds of Hutu extremism against Tutsis were planted and grew. So what was RPF's strategy here in killing? They wanted to eliminate or reduce the numbers of Hutu civilians and establish ethnic domination. They wanted to remove Hutus from political and military power and replace them with Tutsis. They targeted teachers, artists, business people, all community leaders. And the idea was that once these people were gone, the RPF could govern with little resistance. So the RPF ordered its military to cleanse the regions, especially in the north, because it wanted to mold the population map, secure housing for Tutsis who'd been living for decades in Uganda, Congo, and Burundi. So the primary objective was to seize power, consolidate it, and ensure that its members could rule for many years. Interior Tutsis were fodder for its political ambitions. The RPF actually threatened the international community, the UN peacekeeping force, to get out of Rwanda during the genocide. The peacekeepers actually did leave, most of them. A skeletal force remained. So Kagame would later declare, and he still does, that the world abandoned Rwanda during its darkest hour, during its hour of need, but in fact he wanted the international community out. The RPF's invasion of Congo was threefold, essentially. First, to exert control over the mass of Hutu refugees living in the camps on the border. Secondly, the RPF wanted to reduce the numbers of Hutus, and this is evident in the massacres that were documented in the UN mapping report of 2010. And thirdly, they wanted access to the resource-rich Kivu provinces in eastern Congo for their own enrichment. They also had a wider political ambition in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was after the genocide, during the counterinsurgency between 1995 and 1999, that RPF forces staged the greatest number of false flags, or staged attacks, actually. These are designed to deceive. So these false flags are actually meant to make attacks look like the enemy committed them. So in this case, the RPF was attacking and blaming these attacks on Hutu insurgents. These false flags helped justify the RPF's invasion in Congo. There's some testimony at the ICTR that reveals that in March 1996, discussions were undertaken to stage attacks in Rwanda to convince the international community that Hutu rebels were destabilizing the region and threatening to reignite genocide. So after this discussion, some planning occurred, and there were attacks in the region of Ruwengeri and Gisenyi in northwestern Rwanda, according to this testimony. That elicited outrage from foreign governments and media and helped justify the invasion of Congo. Examples of other staged attacks: we have an attack in Kigali Rural in 1996. We have another attack at Mudende refugee camp that killed more than 300 Congolese Tutsi refugees and left 260 or more wounded in December 1997. That attack on Mudende refugee camp in December 1997 was gruesome. RPF commandos used machetes, nail-studded clubs, guns, and grenades to slaughter their victims. There was another false flag in 1998 in a place called Tare, and the RPF set a bar called Pensez-y on Fire. Inside, several hundred people were watching the World Cup finals. I want to make clear for everyone, these stories, these accounts come from Kagame's former officers and soldiers. These are not Hutus who have told me these stories. They're people who worked for Kagame. The key to understanding how the RPF achieved power, concealed their crimes for nearly 3 decades, and how it exerts control over Rwandans today at home and abroad lies in the structure of its military intelligence. The military intelligence called DMI, Directorate of Military Intelligence, has officers and lower-ranking staff in every division of the army, from the high command, gendarmerie, military police, and training wing. These intelligence agents, DMI agents, have infiltrated all the battalions as well, from the company level to the platoon to the smallest section. So it's like opening one of those Russian dolls. You open one, you see a smaller one inside, you open it. It also tapped into the Tutsi civilian population to create a militia whose members were called Abakata. These people were used to cover up RPF crimes, assist in these crimes, and sometimes the civilian militia participated directly in the crimes. So today, these civilian militia members are called Intore. They are Hutus and Tutsis. And these civilian, we call them cadres, civilian cadres are sent abroad also to spy on and engage in criminal activities. They work with Rwandan embassies. The presence of these civilian cadres is felt acutely at the local level in a neighborhood surveillance system called Nyamba Kumi. They uses agents from military, political, and civilian spheres to exert control over Rwandans. The objective of this surveillance system, neighborhood by neighborhood, is to instill fear, keep civilians in their place, to intimidate, and force obedience. Anecdotally, Rwandan refugees in Congo told me there were RPF spies in their camps. I had a hard time believing this, but sources, former soldiers and officers have told me this is true. DMI and its cohort organization, the RPF Secretariat, the Secretariat actually establishes political policy for the RPF. They are responsible for infiltrating international institutions as well. They've worked together doing that. Briefly, I'd like to list a few of the members of the RPF who have infiltrated, we call it infiltrated international institutions. These are people, some of whom who have committed egregious crimes. I'll start with Karenzi Karake. General Karake was head of DMI after the genocide, and he was responsible for gruesome killings at a military barracks called Kami. He was responsible for the assassinations of Canadian priests and Spanish aid workers, and he helped mastermind the invasion of Congo in 1996. In 2007, he was appointed deputy commander of the Joint African Union UN Peacekeeping Force in Darfur, UNAMID, and his mandate was renewed for a year despite an arrest warrant by Spain on charges of genocide. General Patrick Nyamvumba was involved in the murders of thousands of people. He headed a death squad that operated in RPF-controlled zones where Hutu civilians were slaughtered. Patrick Nyamvumba was in 2009 appointed commander of UNAMID in Darfur, the peacekeeping force, and he held this post until 2013. We also have Jean Bosco Kazura. General Kazura was a deputy under Nyamvumba. He was responsible for thousands of Hutus being killed in zones where he operated. Kazura in 2013 was named commander of the UN's stabilizing force in Mali, a post he held until late 2014. Colonel Francis Mutaganda is notorious. He has been accused of being involved in massacres in Ndera and Buyumba during the genocide. In 2011, he was Deputy Chief of Military Planning Services for UN Peacekeeping in New York. The UN became aware of Mutaganda's past, his criminal record following his appointment, but ultimately was unwilling to fire him because Rwanda exerted influence at the UN because of all the troops that it contributes to peacekeeping operations. A few more names. We have Brigadier General Innocent Kabandana, who has been for many years Rwanda's military attaché in Washington. This despite the fact that he was involved in helping organize mass killings of Hutu civilians in southern and central Rwanda. There's another fellow called François-Xavier Ngarambe. He currently is vice president at the UN Human Rights Council, whose secretariat is the UN Office for the High Commission for Human Rights in Geneva. Ngarambe is a long-time RPF civilian cadre. He's helped the RPF conceal crimes over the years. Christine Umatoni is a senior RPF official and one of the regime's long-standing propagandists and ideologues. She's been a central figure in working with the RPF Secretariat in covering up crimes and creating the official genocide story. She is currently UNDP's representative in Mauritius and the Seychelles, and before that she was UNDP's representative in Eritrea. Joseph Mutaboba is also a founding RPF ideologue, and he's also been involved in covering up the regime's crimes, in particular Rwanda's looting of minerals in Congo. Mutaboba has served in a number of high-profile UN positions, but most recently he has been named as deputy head of the UN peacekeeping force in Darfur since 2013. Also, the last person that I wanted to mention is Kirabo Aisa Kachiira, and she has for many years served as the deputy executive director of the UN Habitat Department. She's the wife of Brigadier General Rokabi Kachira, who served as the head of DMI. Rwandan asylum seekers have complained that Rwanda's infiltration of host government agencies and of the UNHCR has unfairly influenced how their claims are treated. Most notably in Kenya, Uganda, Senegal, Malawi, and Mayotte. In many cases, host governments have dismissed claims for asylum, or the UNHCR has refused genuine asylum seekers for resettlement, favoring those who are recruited by the RPF. The UNHCR is also known to use interpreters who work for the Rwandan embassies on highly sensitive statements from asylum seekers on why they fled and why they fear prosecution. I'd like to just briefly touch on how DMI, the military intelligence, and RPF Secretariat, its political bureau, has overseen Rwanda's propaganda system. One of the most notorious RPF propagandists has been a Catholic father, Private Rutazibwa. He's worked hand-in-hand with Western academics, Rakia Omar from the NGO African Rights. Rakia Omar has helped establish the official narrative, receiving directions from DMI and the RPF Secretariat, and she has managed to be involved in how that narrative was constructed and maintained for over 25 years. So Rakia Omar co-authored with British scholar Alex DeWall the defining book, Death, Despair, and Defiance. And they published this 750-page book within weeks of the genocide. It was in September 1994. So Rakia Omar and Alex DeWall created a narrative that cast the violence in Rwanda as a battle of good versus evil, claiming that only Tutsis were victims and only Hutus were perpetrated. Most of all, this account depicted the RPF as saviors. It's now been shown that African Rights became an RPF front organization, and their work was produced with the full and active support of the RPF. It's also been proven that African Rights as an NGO received funding from the RPF. This book or their research had quite an influence at the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and many of its accounts were picked up by Human Rights Watch. So this dominant narrative has helped create false moral legitimacy for the RPF. It's demonized Hutus, and it was used to garner support from the international community and encourage donors to give aid. One of the long-standing claims that everyone has believed is that the Hutu government, the former regime, planned years in advance to carry out genocide. And I spoke with 2 lawyers from the ICTR who worked for the Office of the Prosecutor, and they told me it was false and that was an urban myth, the conspiracy theory. This senior lawyer I spoke to at the Office of the Prosecutor, who used to work at the OPP, said that if there had been an appropriate investigation of who killed Habyarimana, it would have exposed how the genocide occurred, why it occurred, and who was responsible. This senior prosecutor also said that there had been a cover-up at the ICTR, and he said that there was a decision not to prosecute Kagame and his senior commanders for crimes they committed. Because if the ICTR had thoroughly investigated all of Kagame's crimes and issued indictments, those indictments would have reached up to the level of Kagame himself, because he had such tight control over his troops and what they did during the genocide. But instead, Kagame's been protected for a variety of geopolitical reasons, and chief among them, it's been suggested to me, for securing valuable minerals in Congo and providing a corridor for the removal of those mineral riches to Western markets. Thousands of Rwandan and Congolese people have tried to alert the international community to RPF crimes, but these individuals have been intimidated, jailed, silenced, or killed. So because this evidence has been buried, crucial evidence, by powerful interests at the UN and among Western governments, we now have a situation where a suspicion for years now, suspicion of an entire ethnic group has flourished, and we have a misrepresentation of historical events which allows for a cycle of impunity today. So just like to finish with giving you a few examples of some of the evidence that the West has deliberately concealed. Number one, during the genocide. So the U.S. was, the United Nations, was aware of Kagame's troops shooting, stabbing, and burning refugees in the east of the country and dumping the victims in the river, and others being hauled off in trucks, but they bury that information. In September 1994, Robert Gersony, he was a field consultant, he tabled a report to the UN that said 40,000 Hutu refugees were slaughtered in 1/3 of Rwanda's communes. He said these were systematic massacres amounting to genocide. The UN buried that report. Early evidence suggested or indicated that RPF soldiers were responsible for shooting down the plane that triggered the genocide. Louise Arbour, a Canadian prosecutor of the tribunal, shut down that probe, saying she had no jurisdiction to investigate that. A political group of Hutu refugees conducted their own investigations in Congo and Tanzania. They listed the names of 20,000 victims who had been killed in RPF zones by Kagame's army. That investigation was given to the tribunal. I have those lists, and the court buried the findings. There were also lists that were tabled or compiled of the names of 18,000 men, women, and children killed in Gitarama after the RPF seized that zone in June 1994. Those lists were given to the tribunal and they were discarded. For Rwandan refugees, there has been a fundamental breach of trust in their relationship with the international community, especially the United Nations. If trust is ever going to be restored, the UN will have to look squarely at its responsibility in failing to promote accountability in Central Africa. The UN needs to recognize the danger in recommending the return of refugees to a country where criminality has become a way of governing and maintaining power over people's lives. Until the UN takes responsibility and recognizes its historical error in judgment, there can be little hope that the safety, dignity, and rights of Rwandan refugees can begin to be addressed.
ジュリーさん、どうもありがとうございました。